Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for the keynote session, Philipp Rode from LSE.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're in for a massive treat. I hope at least we're going to have a very exciting second keynote this afternoon. And I need to apologize because I completely misjudged this morning the way the conversation would go. I suggested that only this afternoon will we turn towards cities. Well, that was not going to happen. We have talked already the entire day about how urban development, urban policy making, and the role of cities are a central component of this idea of disrupting mobility, but even much more, sort of using technology as a disruptive device of how we live together. So this session is going to be divided into two parts. We'll kick off with a half-an-hour keynote session with two presentations by, I'd say, among the world's most accomplished but very different urban thinkers, Ed Glaeser and Adam Greenfield. I'll introduce them in a moment. The idea of this session really was to step back for a moment and listen to sort of high-level thinking about this relationship between technology on the one hand and cities on the other hand, and then more specifically, the role of transportation in this matrix. And to listen to people who really know what they're talking about, in Ed Glaeser's case, much more from an economics perspective, and in Adam Greenfield's case, much more from a political perspective, all embedded in this context of the city. So let me therefore now introduce our first speaker, Ed Glaeser, who in some ways doesn't really need an introduction. I'll do it nevertheless. Ed Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University and has framed urban debates far beyond the US-American context. And if anyone really tries to want to understand how spatial economists, how people who frame urban development from that perspective go about, Ed is sort of the go-to person. So I'm really delighted that Ed is able to talk to us and share his perspective, his provocations on city and the technology. Ed, over to you. We'll do it for 15 minutes and then have our second keynote.
Thank you, Philip. You know, it's a remarkable sign of the coolness of technology, of how much, how unhip I feel coming from Harvard to MIT. And that wasn't always true, but it is certainly now. I was asked to start by saying something controversial. And I'm going to lead off the talk by saying that there is no technology that any wizard at MIT will ever invent that will be more important for cities than this one, the aqueduct, right? And I want to start with the aqueduct because I think it's really important to think about cities on a grand historical scale. Cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness, and they exist. Their lifeblood is creating interactions. Some of those interactions are good and magical. They're the collaborative chains of creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits, from Athenian philosophy to Facebook. And those interactions still make cities incredibly important creators of technology. And that's one side of the technology-urban interaction. The other side, of course, is the downsides of urban density, the demons that come when people are close enough to exchange contagious diseases, the downsides that come from traffic congestion, from crime, from all of these things which are spread like waves and ripples across urban areas. And technology is also crucial in solving those problems. That's, of course, what the aqueducts are about. There is no more important public function in cities than ensuring clean water. Right? Without it, people die in large scales. And the magic of aqueducts is they enabled these first cities to exist without vast amounts of death. Now, we have our own aqueducts in history and in the United States. And certainly one of the most famous of them was the Croton Aqueduct, built in 1842 in New York, which brought in the clean waters of upstate New York down into the teeming tenements of lower Manhattan. But I put up this graph to make a second point about technology, which is that technology rarely works on its own to solve urban problems. Look at that year, 1842, and certainly if, like me, you were raised on a story of engineering triumphalism in the 19th century, that at one point in time these cities were awful, and then thank goodness Baron Haussmann built the sewers, or thank goodness we built this aqueduct, and then all of a sudden New York became safe, may be puzzled by the time series. You'll notice that this 1842 thing is not followed by a sharp decline in mortality rates. Indeed, New York has a cholera epidemic 25 years after the Croton Aqueduct is put in. What's going on? Why is this change not happening? because, in fact, the poor people of New York chose to ignore the aqueducts. They chose to ignore the sewers. They used the older, cheaper technology that they had been using forever, shallow wells and pit latrines. Now, this point continues to be important today in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Millennium Development Account brings in big water mains, big engineering to actually pipe water in. And the ordinary citizens of cities like Lusaka, which is an area where I do work on water, the ordinary citizens of Lusaka don't think it makes sense to spend $1,000 to pay for that connection. Their per capita GDP, after all, is under $2,000. Without institutional change, in the case of New York, it was the Tenement Act that made it illegal to use those old technologies. It was the Board of Health, which made sure that landlords had to connect to the sewers. Without those regulations that complement the technology, things don't work. And we see this again today in the very slow slog of fighting against open street defecation in India, where the latrines come in, and the latrines can be as magical as you want, but people still use the old technology of defecating in the open street, and will continue to do so until there is something that's a stronger regulatory nudge on this. Now, if you think about technology and urban form in the longer haul, there are technological changes that are centripetal, and there are technological changes that are centrifugal. And among those technological changes, none has been more important than transportation for shaping how cities work. The 19th century was the age of great centripetal forces, great technological changes that pulled people into cities. Perhaps most important of these was, in the United States, was the building of an incredible transportation network that spanned the continent. So if you go back to 1816, you'll find that it cost as much to ship goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the entire Atlantic Ocean, right? No wonder we stayed clustered on our Atlantic seaboard. But over the course of the 19th century, we built an amazing transportation network. First, canals, and then railroads that supplemented the canals, and cities became nodes on that great transportation network. What you're seeing here is Chicago, which after the building of the Illinois and Michigan Canal became the linchpin of a great watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. Of course, the rails ended up being even more important. And what the rails did is they solved the great problem of moving corn over space in the United States. Because the corn was transformed into cows. The cows then came on the hoof to Chicago, and they were slaughtered in the stockyards, thus creating a vast amount of demand for urban workers to do that work. The great technological innovation was Armours, who figures out how to make refrigerated rail cars work. And it's worthwhile remembering how simple his insight was, or rather his engineer's insight, which is you put the blocks of ice on top of the cows rather than below the cows. And so the water drips down on top of the cows, keeping them cold during the voyage east, right? This was a centripetal technology. This enabled people to move in, right? Another one, of course, occurs in the omnibus. Right? This is the dawn of public transportation. Of course, the first guy to run an omnibus in Paris is none other than Blaise Pascal, but in that case, his wager didn't work out so well. It wasn't until the early 19th century that omnibuses became more ubiquitous. This is in Bristol, but New York gets them by the 1820s. And all of our cities were able to be sprawled out because of these public transportation technologies of the time. One thing to remember when you think about urban form, of course, is that the omnibus, like the streetcar, like the elevated rail car, was fundamentally hub and spoke and involved walking at the end of the destination. This kept cities relatively compact. The car, the great 20th century transportation technology, moved people out, right? Because it enabled people to go from point to point. Another really critical centripetal force here was the building of the skyscraper. And the skyscraper reminds us of sort of two distinct things, one of which is the urban ability to create. Right? The skyscraper is not the creation of one single person. William LeBaron Jenney is the architect of this building, the home insurance building in Chicago. But in fact, there's a lively architectural history debate about whether or not Jenney deserves the credit for this. Because in fact, even this building isn't a proper skyscraper, meaning a tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. Only the front two walls have a load-bearing steel skeleton. The back two walls have traditional load-bearing walls, right? And so the debate ranges. Does Jenney deserve the credit? Does his great fireproofing engineer, Peter B. White, deserve the credit? What about Louis Sullivan? What about Burnham? What about Root? What about Adler? You know, all of this misses the point, because in fact the creation of the skyscraper, like every technological advance that humanity has ever been responsible for, is not a solo operation. All of these people knew each other. All of these people worked together. Both Sullivan and Daniel Burnham were apprentices in Jenney's shop. They all learned from each other, and that's how cities work. That's how cities create breakthroughs. In this case, it's also ultimately a transportation breakthrough, because the elevator is itself a great form of public transportation and a highly centripetal one. Now, a similar chain of genius occurs in Detroit about 10 years later, but the upshot of that is deeply centrifugal. And Ford, of course, is also part of a chain of urban genius. The mass-produced car is not just about Ford. It's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant, and nearby Flint, all of whom supplied each other with parts, with ideas, with financing. And they did a miraculous thing, which in the short run made Detroit perhaps the most productive place on the planet. Right? $5 days, employing ordinary workers, cars that have now enabled mobility for far-flung American farmers. You know, amazing stuff, helping to win World War II. But this also ended up being deeply damaging for cities in two distinct ways, one of which is just Detroit's own model of production, emblemized by the River Rouge factory that I've got up there, was fundamentally anti-urban. If you go back to the start of the 19th century, successful cities are marked by three things: smart people, small firms, and connections to the outside world. How far away from that is the Rouge? A vast vertically integrated factory employing tens of thousands of less educated workers. This doesn't need the city, it doesn't give to the city, and when cost conditions change, you just move this factory to lower cost locations, and that's exactly what Ford and other auto manufacturers did. And of course, the thing that it was producing was also profoundly dispersing. Right? The work of Nathaniel Baum Snow at Brown finds that each new highway built after World War II that cut into an urban core reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. This is the decline in the cost of moving goods over the 20th century, which is a 90% decline, enormous technological change. And in this case, as transportation costs fell down, people spread out. You moved factories from older, denser locales to cheaper locales. People moved from areas where firms had a productive advantage to areas in which people wanted to live, which is at least one explanation for why there's no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth in the 20th century than January temperature. What you're looking at here is January temperature and growth over the 2000 to 2010 period. Of course, there are a number of things bound up in that. It's also the fact that warmer places have more pro-business policies. It's also about the fact that more warmer places make housing easier to build, which is an incredibly important part of this. But the January temperature effect on just sheer quality of life is also real. And that's also one thing that lower transportation costs made possible. And of course, along with the move to sprawl, was the move to sun, was the move to sprawl. And sprawl is not just a US phenomenon. This image is from Canada, this image is from Paris, right? The car enabled us to reshape urban forms throughout the world, for good or for ill. Now, while transportation shifts on the suburban edge had a huge impact in urban form, typically the far more incremental improvements in urban mobility that were made possible, let's say, when the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973 subsidized subways in cities, had virtually negligible effects. And I think there's nothing that's more obvious than that than the Detroit monorail built in the 1980s. The critical thing about declining cities is they typically have an abundance of structures and infrastructure relative to the level of demand, and it's easy to get around Detroit, right? It's a city that's built for 1.85 million people, and it is less than half of that. It is madness to build a monorail that glides over essentially empty streets when you can run a bus at whatever speed that you want to run that bus at. And I think this also is a reminder that we can go too far with technological determinism, that in fact it's possible to waste billions of dollars, it's easier to waste billions of dollars with poorly thought out infrastructure projects, even if the engineering is great, than on any other thing that governments do. And that's why cost-benefit analysis as well as appropriate regulatory combinations are really crucial. Now, technology came back again as a centripetal force post-1970. It's easy to forget now, but in 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway that leaves Seattle asking the last person to leave the town to please turn out the lights. Because just as no one could imagine Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine Seattle with a smaller Boeing. Before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, and Starbucks is at best the faint whiff of a caffeinated aroma, right? Starbucks changes, and it changes in a very technologically heavy way, but it doesn't change because of its big industry in particular. The other image is an image of city life in Milan, another former industrial city that came back partially because of technology and partially because of design, reminding us that these two things often go together. That's an artist's rendering. Now, if you ask yourself which cities are able to come back, which cities are not, it's very easy to predict. Human capital is urban density. Detroit and Seattle look different because more than 1/2 of Seattle's adults have college degrees and 1/8 of Detroit's adults have college degrees, right? Education is the lifeblood of urban success. That's precisely because if cities exist to facilitate interactions, then people who know more, right, are able to interact more, are able to teach each other more, are able to learn more. And of course, it's not just the education that we teach in school. It's the skills that are learned, that are acquired on the city streets. It was Alfred Marshall was talking about when he said that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. And when we think about the long run, right, the thing that's sort of most critical for long-run urban growth probably is entrepreneurship. It's the skills and talent to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz looked at New York and Pittsburgh and saw that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. He argued that this was a child of New York's garment district, an area that was a font of entrepreneurship because there were so few barriers to entry, so few returns to scale. By contrast, Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, which bred company men. The question, of course, with entrepreneurship and innovation is we all love it. Can governments engineer it? And this is a picture of the South Boston Waterfront Innovation District, right? A creative attempt here to try and create entrepreneurship in central Boston. But we know that this is hard. And I think in some sense, the big challenge for long-run inclusiveness is to the extent to which we can engineer innovation and entrepreneurship in lower-income areas as well. And that's certainly what I'm most obsessed about. Now, there are other urban innovations. Scott Griffiths is here, so this, I guess, is for him. Other urban innovations also appear to be centripetal in terms of solving urban problems. Zipcar is an example of this, and it hails itself as being a harbinger of the sharing economy. But of course, cities have always been about sharing. What is an urban restaurant but a shared dining room and a shared kitchen? What is an urban park other than a shared backyard? The difference is that technology makes it possible to share more things, which plays to cities' strengths. So think about why they didn't have Zipcar in New York in 1976 when I was a kid. It was because if you went to, Times Square to pick up a car on a Sunday morning, there'd be a pretty good chance there'd be like a dead body in the trunk, right? And you wouldn't know who left the dead body there, and it would be bad, right? But now with the technology, we know. We know who left the dead body there, so we're not afraid of going to pick this thing up. And that's a big deal. Now, cars remind us it is sheer folly to think that the problem of urban congestion is ever going to be solved simply by transportation innovations on its own. As long as you have this fundamental thing that we give away access to city streets and highways for free, you will have overcrowding of city streets and highways. There's no way to have a scarce resource like space that is freely allocated that you're not going to have the overfishing problem. It's just not going to go away. You have to do something like Singapore's innovative congestion pricing program, which also uses technology of its form, which actually charges people for the social costs of their actions. And until we have something that moves towards a case in which we actually charge people to use city streets, we're never going to have those city streets allocated efficiently. Let me just end with sort of three final questions. First of it is, will future technological changes be more likely to be centrifugal and centripetal? I'm certainly betting that they're going to be centripetal for a while. And I think the main point here is that what globalization and new technologies have done is they've radically increased the returns to being smart. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people, right? Everyone here knows this. Everyone here has experienced this, right? We don't go home and just dial it in and learn stuff that way. It's by being in a maelstrom of human activity that we acquire skills. And you see this in the wage data as people who come to cities have faster wage gains over time. It's not that they immediately get their wage bonuses. And we also see this in the choice of companies like Google and Yahoo, which of all the companies in the world should be able to work long-distance employment. And yet what do? They build the Googleplex, they buy 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan, and they regulate their workers to make sure that they go in. Two, will technology solve public problems, or will public control constrain technology? A lot of this is betting on the quality of public government. And there are people here who are fantastic public servants. And they're exactly the sort of people that we desperately need. But you need, in fact, government to do the right things, which is to have rules that supplement technology, like the rules on clean water consumption in New York that pushed people to use the aqueducts, but not to do too much, not to regulate Uber out of existence, not to regulate new innovation out. And lastly, and I think most challengingly, in the area in which I don't know the right answer, but can technology make opportunity more widespread? And I think that is very much the challenge ahead, is to make sure that we see more examples in which technology employs and educates and enlightens people from all educational backgrounds, from all income backgrounds, rather than simply working to those people who have a great deal already. So I'm really delighted to be part of this, and thank you very much for listening. So.
Thank you, Ed, in particular for reminding us that when we are overwhelmed by the future, it's incredibly helpful to go back to the past and understand how cities have actually changed, facing those disruptions we by now have a much better sense of. And also, all the questions which you raised, I'm sure we have an opportunity to come back to as part of the panel. But let's move on to our second keynote speaker. I'm delighted to ask Adam Greenfield, a London-based, by now London-based writer and urbanist, who is probably most well known for his very eloquent and provocative critique around the notion of the smart city. and I'm sure he'll touch upon this, but we have asked him to focus specifically on the question we have just been exploring. Adam, over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. You will forgive me for using a lectern, won't you? It's a little bit old-fashioned, but I find that I need my presenter display, and I'm like that. It is an enormous honor to be here at MIT, and particularly at the Media Lab, a place which has inspired me so much over the years. As Philipp mentioned, you know, I've written a bunch of books about the intersection of networked information technology and urban life, but just as importantly, I've built a lot of stuff as well. I'm intimately familiar with how organizations come together to build network information technologies and deploy them in the urban landscape. And that, I think, gives me a little bit of insight into the ways in which technologies work. What I'm particularly interested in, and what I hope to share with you today, are some thoughts about concretizing what the great French theorist Henri Lefebvre referred to as the right to the city. The right, the inalienable right that each and every single one of us enjoys to participate in all the circuits of exchange and influence that constitute a great urban place. And you know, in this, I had cause to think of the great debate that has gone on in technological circles since time immemorial between the two polar ideas of technological determinism on the one hand and social constructionism on the other hand. Ed alludes a little bit to this. Technological determinism, of course, being the idea that you take technologies almost like a medicine dropper, and you drop them into urban place, and they uncomplicatedly have effects. Technology in this model is serene and self-contained. It does things to the world. And social constructionism is the completely opposite perspective. Social constructionism is the idea that societies differentially adopt technologies that are congenial to them, that have values that are aligned with their own values. And you know, I'll confess to you that I've never been a pure techno-determinist, but I was certainly never as much of a social constructionist as I've become in the last couple of years as I've watched something very interesting evolve. Right around 2009, I started to think of what would happen if we raised spatial resources to the network and made them available for sharing, if we opened them up to temporary use, to negotiated short-term use. And I call this space as a service because, you know, I'm kind of fixated on my jargon. The sharing economy, something as simple and elegant, a formulation as beautiful like that would never have occurred to me. I had to give it a big, heavy, jargony idea like this, space as a service. What was the idea of space as a service? Well, the idea was that there was a hospitality space in which there were, at that time, two different ideas about how to use the network to distribute spatial resources evenly and equally to everybody who wanted them. There was a non-commercial alternative called couchsurfing.org, a bottom-up network of people around the world who simply, almost literally at times, had a sofa or a spare room in their place. They didn't want money for it. They wanted cultural exchange. They wanted somebody in the house. They wanted to meet new people and be exposed to new ideas, as Ed correctly notes is what cities are for. And of course, there was also a commercial model. There was something called Airbnb. Now, Airbnb took the same approach, but instead of opening these things up as free resources, these were commercial resources. You're supposed to give a credit card, and it went through a vending processing system, and it leased out space. And what I was inspired by in my formulation of space as a service was that these two things could live in blissful coexistence. The idea that the commercial model and the non-commercial model could live side by side, neither one cannibalizing the other, both of them treating the same sort of resource, but deploying them to different ends with different populations and satisfying a wide variety of needs. Well, what happened? You know, reality intervened is what happened. And a network that the couchsurfing community had built up very consciously as a fabric of relationships, voluntary, bottom-up, joyful relationships among people who simply wanted to meet and learn from one another. Well, that was replaced by something else. That network that was built up was conceived in the era in which Airbnb skyrocketed in valuation. All of a sudden, people began to perceive the commercial value of that network qua the network. It became thought of as an asset. And what happened was essentially a hostile takeover of couchsurfing.org. It was transformed into a pale imitation of Airbnb, a pallid commercial version, a competitor, not really, because it wasn't nearly as good or as well developed for the purposes of commercial utilization of temporary space as Airbnb was. Essentially, couchsurfing.org went away and Airbnb triumphed, to the extent that 57.4% of listings on Airbnb in San Francisco right now are actually whole buildings, not apartments, not spare rooms, not spare couches, but whole buildings, whole apartments. Now, this happens to be illegal, even under San Francisco's weak regulation at present. But never mind the fact that it's illegal, it's dominant, it's there. It is the commercial alternative has, in fact, squeezed out everything else. The non-commercial, the bottom-up, the sharing, the genuine sharing economy no longer exists as a resource because the network that facilitated it was turned to different ends. The people who made up the couchsurfing.org network realized that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they scattered to the four winds. The value in that acquisition evaporated when the people who made it what it was decided that they didn't want to be much a part of it. Well, it's kind of the same thing in the mobility space. There used to be all sorts of technologically facilitated alternatives to the sharing of mobility resources and assets. And now there's essentially one, the one that we're all familiar with. What happened to ride sharing? What happened to peer-to-peer car sharing? What happened to these brilliant, useful, vital, clever, creative ways of utilizing shared networked resources? We don't hear very much about that anymore. And the conclusion that I'm forced to come to is that these technologies didn't change the societies that they were deployed into, but that the society, a late capitalist society with very strong values, changed the nature and the adoption curve of the technologies it was offered. It's essentially a social constructionist position. I'm not super comfortable with it, but these are the facts on the table. What we're left with is no choice at all. What we're left with now is Uber. And Uber, I have to tell you, is something that I regard as a socially corrosive entrant into the mobility sweepstakes. I regard Uber as, something that erodes our values, something that erodes the possibility of sharing, something that erodes the possibility of us living in a just and an equitable society. And I have to say that the only reason Uber is competitive is because it externalizes everything. It bears no risk, it sheds every cost, and it sheds that cost onto us. I will give you an example of this. This is Sophia Liu, a 6-year-old school child in San Francisco. Unfortunately, she never made it past the age of 6 because she was hit by an Uber driver in San Francisco on the last day of 2013, an Uber driver named Syed Muzaffar. Now, Muzaffar was cruising the streets of San Francisco looking to pick up a client, a customer, when he hit Sophia Liu. He had the application open. He conceived of himself as working for Uber. But Uber is a network mobility organization, right? They don't conceive of themselves as being subject to the laws that we have governing other sorts of mobility alternatives, and they hung him out to dry. And they said this. They said, "Our hearts go out to the family and victims of the accident that occurred in downtown San Francisco. We work with transportation providers across the Bay Area, but we can confirm that this tragedy did not involve a vehicle or a provider doing a trip on the Uber system. Their contention was that they were liable in no way because he was not actually carrying an Uber passenger at the time he hit Sophia Liu." What has happened here is that a human being has been treated by the Uber mobility provider as an externality. And so every time I hear this word externality, I have to think of the human beings that are behind it. I find it a very bloodless and frankly an offensive way of describing what Uber is doing to our communities and our cities. But I don't want to blame the technology at the heart of it. I think that there are ways that we can design these systems to function in ways that are more consonant with our deeper values. I'd like to offer an alternative model, that instead of building ratchets that only move in one direction, instead of building engines of structural inequality, we turn our ingenuity towards the engineering of structural justice. Because after all, what is Uber but a spatialized resource allocation algorithm with a brand on top of it? That's all it is. And if that's all it is, then we can design other spatialized resource allocation algorithms with brands on top of them, some under public control and regulation, as in here, with Halo and the Black Cabs of London, and some here, as in Helsinki, the very innovative Kutsu Plus system. This is a kind of vehicular mobility proposition that we barely even have a category for. It is a public mobility solution that is almost point-to-point and on-demand. You use a cell phone app, a mobile phone, smartphone app, to hail the Kutsu Plus van, and then it tells you what bus stop to go to. So it kind of splits the difference between public transit as we understand it and the emergent bottom-up, point-to-point, on-demand alternative. And I think that these propositions point the way toward a more fruitful balance and a more fruitful bargain between information technology and the people who live in the cities that we live in, love in, learn in, and thrive in. It has to be said that both kinds of vehicles in this image are endangered species. Both the big red bus that's so iconic of London and the private automobile are probably on the verge of disappearing because we are on the verge of inventing entirely new ways to deploy, to allocate, and to select those mobility assets. We talk, and we've been talking at this event all day, about automated, autonomous vehicles. The trouble is that when we do so, especially when we do so in the context of policy, we need to be very careful, because this is an abstraction. The idea of an autonomous vehicle is an abstraction. Even this, several steps further down the road though it is, this is also an abstraction. But this is a proposition. This is an actual deployed autonomous vehicle system that's out there right now. And the thing about propositions is that we can evaluate them. We can evaluate the ways in which they live up to or they fail to live up to the social contracts that we expect them to fulfill in their operation in our streets and in our lives. And as we evaluate these propositions, some of us will be doing so as designers. And if there's anything that we know as designers, as the old English proverb has it, it's that the devil is in the details, or the version that I prefer, Ludwig Wiesmann, that he said, God is in the details. The details of service design, the details of user experience design and of interface design, the details of writing and crafting the regulation, the legislation that governs the operations of these vehicles on our streets and in our lives. This is what makes all the difference between something that is corrosive of our deepest values, that harms us at a very deep level, and something that fulfills our ambition and even our dreams of effortless, on-demand, point-to-point mobility. You know, with all the technology that we have available to us, it's an incredible time, but it's not available equally. We know this. All of us know this. Guilty conscience or with a clear conscience, we know this, that the distribution of access to these resources is not nearly as just as it should be. And I will argue to you that this should have been our golden age, not just for a few, but for everyone in the city. And it is my great hope that the people in this room, working together with the people that we aim to serve, we can make it so. It can still be a golden age. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Adam, thank you so much for a very powerful talk where it's very hard to, in some ways, stand here on stage and sort of logistically follow up. I think the reminder of the risks of the technologies, but at the same time giving us also a notion of hope that there's still something we can do around it, is something we're going to discuss in a moment. So I need to now remind everyone in the room that we will have 2 parallel sessions happening. We'll continue here on the subject we have just introduced with a panel discussion. And next door, we're going to focus on access and equity in a sort of more focused way. So if those that are interested and signed up for access and equity, please make your way to the other room. Everyone else, please stay here, and we'll continue immediately. Don't have a coffee. This continues in literally 60 seconds. Thank you very much.